Thank you very much, Francois. I hope you're not falling asleep after a lovely lunch we just had. I'm going to be talking about the new non-domestic part of building regulations, so Part L2A. My name is Sam Archer. I've been technically leading the non-dom work for Welsh Government on behalf of AECOM. So I just thought I'd start my talk by having a recap on how building regulations currently works in 2010 for England and Wales. There are 5 mandatory criteria, number 1 being the building emission rate, so effectively a calculation of carbon emissions for the building that you compare to a notional building. The second one, limits on design flexibility, so backstop values, so values that you must not do any worse than. And the last 3, which are limiting the effects of solar gain in summer, so making sure that your building won't overheat, quality of construction and commissioning, and the providing of information. The last 3 haven't changed at all in Wales, and there are no proposals to make changes to those 3 parts of L2A in 2014. So the rest of my talk is going to be about parts 1 and 2, and specifically really about part 1, because part 2 there are very few changes. So just to quickly talk about criterion 2. Criterion 2 are the backstop values, so backstop U values, and then backstop efficiencies for building services plant, contained mainly within the non-domestic building services compliance guide. I think it was mentioned in this morning's talk that the compliance guides, both domestic and non-domestic, are going to be the same for England and Wales, a joint publication, but there are some revisions to those documents being planned at the moment, small revisions I should say. But an important thing to get across from this slide is that the backstop values you must not do worse than. But if you built your building to the values in the non-domestic building services compliance guide for a new build, you wouldn't pass, because the notional building for criterion 1 is much tougher. As an example of that, in the notional building for criterion 1, the chiller seasonal efficiency is 4.5, but the backstop is only 2.5. So you could put a chiller of 2.5 in your building, but you would find it difficult to comply. So the question that we've been asking ourselves in England and Wales is this backstop approach sufficient as a form of energy efficiency? And as we'll see from this talk, we don't think it is. And in Wales, we're proposing a form of energy efficiency control in addition to the TER, but I'll go on to talk about that. So criterion 1, from 2010, it's been based around a recipe approach. And to explain that, at the top there we've got your actual building, your real building, with its real U values and building services efficiencies and so on. And through the national calculation methodology, that produces a building emission rate, in other words, carbon emissions for the building. And alongside that, the software develops a notional building. And that's a standard building with standard U values, standard building services efficiencies, but the same size and shape as your actual building. And that produces a target emission rate. And really, since 2006, criterion 1 has really been about this comparison between your actual building and a notional building. And the approach in Wales is to continue with that, but with some tweaks, which I'll go on to talk about. One of the criticisms that we've had of this approach is that it concentrates on CO2 rather than energy, so there's been a lot of talk about that, and there's a possibility of greenwash. So clearly with carbon reduction, there are 2 ways of reducing carbon, essentially. You can reduce energy demand, or you can provide a low carbon energy supply. And I think most consultants, most people in the industry would say that in terms of cost effectiveness, it's better to look at energy demand reductions before looking at low carbon supply reductions. So, for example, if you concentrate on CO2, it's very easy, or has been very easy, to greenwash. You put in a biomass boiler, you get a big reduction in CO2 and you pass, but without necessarily doing very much with the fabric of your building. And that's really what building regs is all about, fabric and building services efficiency. So there's been a desire to implement some kind of energy efficiency test before low carbon supply, and as probably been described this morning, for domestic in England and in Wales, there's been consideration of a fabric energy efficiency standard. And similarly for non-domestic buildings, there's been discussion about whether we should have some sort of fee standard for non-domestic buildings. The conclusion of the research we've done both in England and Wales is that wouldn't be appropriate. I won't go into detail now why, but it's within the consultation documents. But other EU member states don't look at CO2. The UK is one of the few member states that does look at CO2. Most of the member states look at energy, and lots and lots of the, quite a few of the member states look at primary energy as a factor. Here we've got Republic of Ireland, Germany and Italy have primary energy as their major metric for building regulations. And for that reason, and because it helps with the energy efficiency, an effort on energy efficiency, we propose that primary energy is brought into the regs for Wales. So to explain what primary energy is energy which has not undergone any conversion or transformation process. In other words, it's raw fuel. So for electricity, the primary energy factor for grid electricity 2.58. What that means is you need 2.58 units of raw fuel in order to generate a delivered 1 unit of electricity. And so during the consultation on 2010 SAP for England, the BRE produced a table of carbon emission factors, but they also produced a table of primary energy factors. And primary energy is really a driver behind the EPBD. It's what member states have to report. And so we think it's important for people to start getting to grips with the concept of primary energy, and hence another reason why we brought it into Welsh regs. So why does it help with greenwash? Well, primary energy really just talks about raw fuels. So the primary energy factor for biomass is 1.07. It's very similar to the primary energy factor for gas. In other words, what it's saying is that biomass is a precious resource just like gas is, and so it treats them the same. And in that respect, it makes it much harder to use low carbon fuels as a means of greenwash. There's another consideration, which is what primary energy factor to use for electricity generating technologies on site like PV and wind. The EU doesn't give very good guidance on this. It lets member states come up with their own factors, and what you find is throughout Europe there are lots and lots of different factors. Most commonly the factor is 1, but we've decided in Wales to give it a factor effectively of 0, so it would be treated in the same way as grid electricity, but I'll go on to talk about that. So, what we've introduced into Welsh building regulations, in addition to the BER-TER calculation for criterion 1, we've introduced this BPEC-TPEC calculation. And BPEC stands for Building Primary Energy Consumption, and TPEC stands for Target Primary Energy Consumption. So essentially we've got exactly the same approach, a notional building and an actual building, a standard specification that produces both a carbon emission rate and also a primary energy rate. And the idea behind that being that the target primary energy consumption, the first step for criterion 1, is a measure of energy efficiency, and then the second one, that the target emission rate, the carbon emission rate, is a measure of essentially of low carbon energy supply. So it's an energy demand and low carbon supply test. So, for consultation, the first question that we ask around non-domestic buildings is, do you think that this proposal to regulate energy efficiency separately in this way with a primary energy standard is appropriate for Wales? So it would be interesting to get your feedback on that. So, as Francois mentioned in his talk this morning, we're continuing with the aggregate approach. The non-domestic sector is very, very different from the domestic sector in the sense that there are a huge number of different types of buildings. Even within the healthcare sector, there's small little doctor surgery as opposed to a massive great hospital. So each of those different buildings has very different abilities to reduce carbon and to meet the regulations. And hence, since 2010, in England and Wales, we've had this aggregate approach where we're effectively trying to get each of the buildings to pass using the similar levels of performance, similar U values, similar energy efficiencies. But what that means is each of them will have different carbon reductions as a result. So when you combine those different carbon reductions together and you multiply by how many of those different building types you have, you end up with an aggregate overall percentage reduction. So in England, there's a proposal for an overall percentage reduction of 25%, but some buildings will be achieving 10%, some buildings will be achieving 40%, concomitant with their ability to actually meet that regulation. So the modelling we've done, we've modelled in Wales, we've modelled in different fabric packages. So fabric package A is 2010 regs as it is at the moment. We've then looked at modelling progressively harder packages from A through to D, where D would be a very, very tight fabric. U values of 0.1 for the roof and so on, window U values of 1.4 and 3 for an air tightness. So a pretty tight fabric standard. Similarly then for building services, we've modelled down from package 1, the 2010 notional building as it is currently, right through to package 3, looking at higher levels of lighting performance, higher levels of terminal unit performance, so things like fan coil units, and different controls added to the building, improved controls as we go through the modelling. And what we find when we do that is, as you'll see there, this is a table of actually primary energy consumption improvements on 2010, starting with A1, which is the current 2010 notional building, which is obviously a 0% improvement, right through to D3, which would be the most onerous package we've thrown at it for thrown at Wales for 2013, and that's giving a 16.3% reduction over 2010. Now what that tells us is that if we want to push the standard much beyond 16%, we're going to have to start introducing renewables, and again I'll go on to talk about that. So really we see 16 to 20% really is the limit of what can be done through improvements to fabric and building services overall in non-domestic buildings. So, what are the packages we put through to consultation? In the consultation document, there are 2 primary energy targets as consultation proposals. One that would achieve a 7% reduction in primary energy over 2010, and a second one that would be slightly more onerous and achieve a 10% reduction. And what we've done is we've split the building types into 3. Well, it's actually 4, but I'll say 3 to make things a little bit simpler. Essentially, side-lit buildings split into 2. So side-lit buildings that are just heated only, side-lit buildings which are air-conditioned. So here we've got the retail building and the offices, side-lit air-conditioned buildings. And then finally a category for top-lit buildings, which would be the sort of warehouse sector. And there we've got slightly different standards, slightly different notional buildings for Criterion 1 for those different building types, again reflecting their differing abilities to meet the standards. So I won't go into too much detail because I've got some more slides on this later on, but this is really just reiterating that for the 7% and the 10% standards, we've got slightly different notional buildings for the different building sectors. So what does that mean in terms of performance? For the 10% reduction, I'll just talk about 10% reduction because that's the government's preferred option. What it would mean is that the U values generally are unchanged from 2010. The majority of the analysis that we've done so far on cost benefit sort of suggests that the U values in 2010 are at the limit of where we'd want to go. The reason being for that if you improve the U values further in non-domestic buildings generally, you get small carbon savings for a lot of cost. So there's not a suggestion that we're going to improve those very much. But air tightness has been increased for heated only buildings. We've taken it to 3. And then following feedback from some of these some of the consultation sessions we had before the consultation went out, a lot of people were saying that small buildings in particular find air tightness difficult. So here we're proposing for side-lit heated-only buildings that the air permeability wouldn't be taken to 3, it would remain at 5. For building services, there have been more changes, increases in changes, and again that comes about as part of the cost-benefit analysis, showing that we can get high carbon savings more cheaply through building services than through fabric. So the lighting luminaire efficiency has been bumped up from 55 to 65 luminaire lumens per circuit watt. We've introduced occupancy control where previously in 2010 there wasn't occupancy control in the notional building. Terminal unit efficiency has been increased slightly and most onerously for air-conditioned buildings. So really what we're pushing now is for ECDC fan coil unit motors, which we see being used in more and more buildings. And finally, we've got demand control for ventilation, so increasing or decreasing the ventilation rate according to essentially occupancy has gone in as well into the notional building. So some questions. Which package of fabric and services should be selected? Should we go to 7% or a 10% increase in primary energy consumption or reduction? Do you foresee any particular issues for certain categories of buildings? So it'd be very interesting to get feedback on modelling that you've done hopefully using the consultation version of CSBEM for Wales. For your particular building sectors, in England we've had representations from particularly things like the warehouse industry on the effect of the regulations, and then finally a particular sort of building area, small buildings. We're aware that there are particular issues for SBEM, and we'd love to hear about your small buildings and what problems you've had with compliance in those buildings. So, moving on to carbon emissions. Once we've moved away from primary energy, we also want to reduce carbon emissions as well. What we're finding is that, as I was saying with that table, really 16 to 20% is at the limit of what can be achieved through fabric and building services. So we've suggested that we've got to start introducing renewables in the notional building to stretch the target. If you start looking at all of the different renewables you can have in a non-domestic building, obviously there are quite a few of them, but they're all really dependent on the particular building that you're looking at. You know, for biomass supplies, is there a local biomass supply? For wind turbines, is the wind speed correct, and so on. Really, for us, the only technologies that are universally applicable is solar technologies, so PV and solar thermal. And we've opted for, as for dwellings, we've opted for PV as a means of setting the target. So I can't reiterate enough that PV is just a proxy, it's a means of setting a target. You don't have to use PV in your actual buildings, you can use other renewables, but it's a target setting process. So, sorry, just going back to this. For dwellings as well, we've got PV as a proxy. It has been expressed for dwellings as percentage of roof area. We've moved towards percentage of floor area in non-domestic buildings. And the reasoning behind that is that percentage of floor area more accurately represents the energy use of the building, because the energy use of the building really is proportionate to the area of the floor area. And hence we've expressed the PV percentage in the notional building as percentage of floor area, but limited it to 50% of the roof area. So if your notional building is very tall and therefore has a small roof area, it doesn't go beyond 50% of the roof area of the building. So, which approach should be utilised to incorporate the incorporation of low and carbon technologies? Is a consultation question for you. One piece of feedback we've had from England and from the consultation sessions we had previously in Wales was that, I think it was a concern expressed by a person who asked the question this morning, that if the notional building has PV in it, will that be not incentive, but will that give people guidance? Will people think, well, PV must be the technology I should use? PV is, as I said, is a proxy, and it in no way reflects the opinion of government that that's the right technology to put in your buildings. So maybe instead of expressly saying it's PV in the notional building, we should just give a fixed carbon reduction through low and zero carbon technologies, so as not to try and give that impression that PV is what we want you to put in. Again, as I was saying, for dwellings, it's expressed as roof area. We've decided that we think probably floor area is better, or maybe there's some other metric, some other way of incentivising renewables that would be better. So that's a consultation question for you to reply to. So the target emission rate, that's been around since 2006 and continues hopefully in Wales. And there are three consultation levels of performance that we want to consult on, A, B and C. The first one, 10%, then 11%, and then 20%. 20% is the preferred target, aggregate target reduction in Wales. The first one, target A, is the 7% primary energy reduction through energy efficiency, then 1% of the floor area added on as PV. Target B is 10%, so the higher fabric and building services package, this time with no PV. We've presented here a package where we don't have to start incorporating renewables. So again, it would be interesting to get your feedback on whether you think it's a good idea that we should start introducing renewables to the target setting. And finally, package C, which again uses the higher fabric energy efficiency standard, effectively, in conjunction with 5% of the floor area as PV, and that produces a 20% overall reduction. And that's the preferred reduction for Wales. So there's a consultation question on that, which is your preferred target, A, B or C. Do the proposed 2013 notional buildings as set out in the changes to the national calculation methodology seem a reasonable basis for standard setting? So overall, this is a question about, 20% might be a good idea as an improvement, but maybe we've got the balance of fabric, building services and renewables wrong. Maybe we should be pushing U values more and so on. We're interested to get your feedback on the notion, effectively on the notional buildings that we put forward for consultation. Finally, here I've got some slides on some changes to the NCM and treatment of different things within the inputs to SBEM and to dynamic SIMS. For biomass and heat pumps in 2010, we changed things whereby, in order to try and stop this greenwash effect, you have the same heating fuel in your notional building as your actual building. So if you put biomass in your building, you get biomass in the notional building, and in that way it reduces the incentive to greenwash. With our introduction of the primary energy metric in Wales, there's no longer the need for that. So biomass and all other technologies get treated in exactly the same way. And as a consequence, we've introduced the same approach that exists in Scotland at the moment, which is that if you've got gas availability, if you've got a gas main in your streets, then the notional building will assume gas as the notional building. And if you've got come to me in a minute. If you haven't got gas, then it assumes oil. Treatment of lighting, this is also quite a major change. We were aware that there are quite a few instances where people are really overlighting spaces, so supermarkets being lit to 2,000 lux. Under the current regulation, under 2010, the lux level gets prorated to the level in the notional building. So if you're lighting your supermarket to 2,000 lux, the software would ignore that and assume that you're lighting to the notional level of 800 lux. We've suggested that's changed, so if you overlight your space, you have to put in the actual wattage, the actual increased wattage as a result, and you'll be penalised for doing that. Treatment of district heating, small little change there. Again, previously in 2010, it was the case that if you put in district heating, then you also had district heating in the notional building. There's a slight change here in that notional building CO2 emission factor for district heating will always be 0.15, regardless of what systems you've got in place. And that means that if you've got a really good district heating system with very high efficiency CHP and so on, then you'll substantially improve on that. And then a very final question that we've got in the consultation is on mixed mode ventilation. Again, there's been criticism generally about the fact that if you've got air conditioning in your building, the notional building also has air conditioning. And that means there's no incentive to use lower carbon ventilation strategies like natural ventilation or mixed mode. Interestingly, for the EPC methodology, it doesn't work like that. For the EPC methodology, the building is always mixed mode regardless. And that means if you've got a naturally ventilated building, you can show an improvement. If you've got an air-conditioned building, it's slightly worse. So there's a question about, in the consultation, about maybe we should introduce that into Part L to incentivise people to use lower carbon forms of ventilation. But we're aware that there may be some sort of perverse outcomes from that. Clearly if you've got a very busy city centre site, where maybe the facades have to be sealed and you've got no choice but to use air conditioning, that maybe would be a problem. So we'd be interested in feedback on that. So finally, the questions. Question 19 is a question about what I've just described. So would it be appropriate to adopt this mixed mode notional building for Part L? Question 20, any other comments about the national calculation methodology? Just a general question, a round-up, clean-up question. Consultation 21 talks about the impact assessment. So when we do the impact assessment on national impact, what we're looking at is things like build rates, so how many of the different types of buildings are built in Wales at any given time, assumptions about renewables and efficiencies and so on. So it'd be interesting to get people's feedback on whether those assumptions are fair. And finally, question 22 is about costs. Virtually everything that we do for government in terms of building regulations looks at costs and benefits. We're increasing the cost burden on developers and having to install more renewables, but then you get the benefit of lower fuel bills. And so there's a really important synergy between the higher cost but the higher benefits. And so a lot of the cost data that goes into our models is really, really important, and it's really important that we get feedback from you on the costs that we use. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Right, are there any questions for Sam on the new build non-domestic proposals?
Where you've made a change to the lighting,
yep.
Are these three still working in line with the CSLL lighting guides?
Well, in what sense would they not?
Well, if you're not lighting in certain areas the same level, you do get uniformity in the space. And quite often, especially on new builds, you're not going to have a layer of where people are sitting, the desks are, so you start doing whole floor for it at a single level.
Yeah.
So that sort of makes it unfair then on.
Well, It's interesting you raise that issue, because we think that going to an overall wattage level rather than watts per square metre per 100 lux means that you can use exactly that approach. So the notional building does assume uniform light. For an office, it would assume 400 lux over the whole floor plate. But if you only lit to 400 lux over the desks, which is current SSL guidance, then you'll have a lower overall watt over the floor plate, and hence you'll do better. So we think it's an improvement in that respect.
But in 2010, find at the moment light installing doesn't work because getting all the light bounced with ceiling, the walls, with the guides, we find that our wattage isn't quite as good as we can get on some buildings. Obviously, because of the shape of the building will make a big difference.
That's right. Yeah. Where that comes from is there's a calculation within the national calculation methodology that turns the luminaire efficiency, which is the sort of basis of calculation, into a watts per square metre, and we have been reviewing that calculation. We've been looking at that, so that might change, and we'd love your feedback on design showing where you've had difficulty. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. Given that the appearance of fracking for gas is now forecast to give us potentially globally another 300 years of low gas cost energy, shouldn't we be focusing more on CO2 emissions than primary energy?
I mean, government policy to date, Welsh Government, UK Government, has all been around carbon. I mean, there are certain drivers, and the recast, the directive is a good example, where certain targets are being required of us by Europe, and those are generally in relation to energy targets. But everything that the government does for the foreseeable future is going to be based around carbon targets. I don't see any change in that. But we do have to deal with what's coming out of Europe, and there's certain drivers which will cause us to report on primary energy.
Yeah, I mean, if I could offer another point as well, which is that we're not concentrating on CO2. There's still a CO2 target in there, and it's still going to be quite stringent. There's just, in addition to that, an energy target. So we're saying we need to tackle both. We need to tackle energy demand, and we need to tackle carbon emissions.